Good afternoon and welcome to Rails to Trails Conservancy's Trails Transform America webinar. I'm Kevin Mills, the Senior Vice President of Policy for Rails to Trails, and today I'll be your host and moderator. With us today, we have Hussein Cumber, the Executive Vice President of Florida East Coast Industries, a railroad and real estate company, and he has championed the Ludlam Trail in Miami-Dade County. We have Greg Cox, a San Diego County Supervisor and recipient of Rails to Trails Rail Trail Champion Award, and he'll be discussing San Diego County's Regional Bike Network Plan. We also have Jenny Salim, City Council member and former mayor of Morgantown, West Virginia. She's representing the Parkersburg to Pittsburgh Corridor Project, which is part of the four-state Industrial Heartlands Trail. And then we have John Callahan, the Director of Transportation for Louisville Metro Government, and he's addressing the Louisville Loop, which is in Jefferson County, Kentucky. Let me at the outset say that we'll save questions for the end of the panel discussion, but you can submit questions via the chat box at any time during this webinar. I also want to thank at the outset here Leanne Sinpatanasical for masterminding and organizing this event, our communications team led by Brandy Horton, along with Susan Matyas and Anthony Lay for their support, and as well as Patrick Woyan and Ken Bryan for helping to engage panelists. Today, we're going to hear from this distinguished panel of local elected and business leaders about how trail networks transform communities, and we're going to examine the prospects for federal infrastructure legislation, opining on how Washington might help or hinder prospects for getting trail and active transportation networks built. To frame up this discussion, I am going to provide a little context that with some background on how I see the current federal policy making environment pan out for trails. And my read on what's likely to happen in Washington this year regarding infrastructure starts with the president, who said that this is a top legislative priority going into the year, and he's asking Congress to do this next, and he's calling it an easy win. We do expect him to address it in the State of the Union address and to release principles to guide legislators on the issue. In terms of Congress, we do see some bipartisan appetite for the topic, but there are also competing issue priorities. For instance, House Speaker Ryan has said he's most interested in moving entitlement reform. So my assessment is that this issue is likely to be debated this year, but it's unclear whether it will advance as an issue. I think the biggest question going into the year is where would the dollars come from to do this, especially in the wake of tax reform? There are also differing policy approaches in play, with the administration taking a little bit more of a clean slate approach and members of Congress tending to be more interested in funding the transportation reauthorization they passed 2 years ago called the FAST Act. So in 2018, we think the prospects are brightest early in the year and politically speaking, likely to dim as the elections near. But we feel at Rails to Trails that it's really important to engage in this debate, even if it withers on the vine. The debate this year is likely to set the policy parameters for anything that might get done in 2019 or in 2020 with a new transportation reauthorization. So what's the standing of trails in all of this? It certainly would be affected by which policy approach is pursued. Congress could pursue a combination of old and new approaches, or either or, and we need to be prepared in any case. But regardless of whether trails are top of the mind for policymakers, we know that key congressional committee members tend to support the balance of transportation choices that they forged in the FAST Act 2 years ago, and that includes trails especially through the transportation alternative set aside. What's more uncertain is what would happen and how trails would fare under the administration's approach. But whether they know it or not, supporting trails is really what would deliver on the public and what the policy makers and the public have said they most want. Trails are vital to the modern American economy, just like roads and railroads. We create needed connections within and between regions. We're providing affordable urban mobility. It's a way to opt out of congestion, first and last mile connections, access to jobs and what have you. And it also provides sorely needed rural economic development, which has been a priority in the president's proposal. The president's proposal also emphasizes transformative projects. And while they might be picturing massive projects, we believe trail and active transportation networks provide transformative benefits such as job creation and improved health and environment. In just the 4 regional projects that we're going to be hearing about today, totaling $407 million in project costs, we would generate more than 7,700 jobs projecting from economic studies. And if we use the 17 jobs per million spent that was found from a study by AASHTO, which represents the state DOT heads, that trails create more jobs per dollar than any other type of transportation infrastructure. Finally, in terms of comparing this to the administration's proposal, one hallmark has been that they seek to leverage federal dollars with state, local, and private dollars. And trails historically have attracted a bigger match than other types of projects. And the return on investment is also typically higher. So one example of this leverage is, on average, the projects that we've collected for this campaign have 65% of the cost covered at this point. And that suggests that there's a whole lot of skin in the game for other entities than the federal government, but they need that federal partnership to succeed. Another kind of leverage is how trails reduce healthcare costs by increasing physical activity and reducing chronic disease. And that can save at least hundreds of millions of dollars per year. So now what is Rails to Trails doing? Since we feel like this offers what policymakers need, we're embarking on a national campaign with our partners and supporters to inject trails into the federal infrastructure debate. And we're offering 3 principles to legislators as they begin to think about this legislation. The first is that the benefit of trail networks and active transportation are such that it warrants robust federal investment. And the share of federal highway dollars that are dedicated to active transportation currently, about 1.8%, is a valid floor. But when we look at the burgeoning demand out in the country, we feel like there's need for quite a bit more. Then the second principle is that trails and active transportation currently are broadly eligible across transportation programs for funding. That needs to continue, and if new programs are created, need to be part of that as well. And then the final principle we're bringing to the table is that new funding will do the most good if we focus it on concentrated investments in trail and active transportation networks, making all of those connections between an infrastructure that exists so that you can connect people in places, and that gives you the biggest bang for the buck. So with that context, let's turn to the panelists. And I want to start with an opening question. We have this wonderful bipartisan panel of experts. We've got business leaders, we've got elected officials, we've got regional transportation officials. And I want each of you to explain what is the project you're representing and why have you advocated for prioritizing trails? Let me start with Hussein.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks for arranging this webinar. And I'm also appreciative of you including me on a distinguished panel. So a little background on Florida East Coast Industries probably will help understand why we are such a big advocate of the Rails to Trails program in Miami-Dade County. So Florida East Coast Industries is a company that's been around for over 100 years. It was founded by Henry Flagler, who, for history buffs will remember, he was a partner in Standard Oil with Rockefeller. And he came to Florida, invested his money building a rail line from Miami to Key West. And along the way, he really opened up Florida to development. And so we're very proud of that history that we have of really being able to provide infrastructure that results in major economic development activities. And so when we looked at an abandoned rail line that we had in Miami-Dade County, as urbanism has really has been kind of taking hold the last decade, especially in South Florida, where you're bordered by an ocean on one side and the Everglades on the other side. Having an abandoned rail corridor really ended up, we believe, holding back a community from being able to move forward. And so what we didn't want to do is create a trail that really didn't provide the greatest economic development spark for the community. And so what we looked at is, we've all heard of TOD, transit-oriented development. We kind of came up with our own TOD, trail-oriented development. And when you take a trail and you actually put the right kinds of development along that trail, what you end up doing is forcing people to use that trail to go between retail, residential, and other types of development. And a challenge for us in Miami-Dade County was the fact that this corridor went through a commercial part of Miami-Dade County, an industrial part of Miami-Dade County, and a residential part of Miami-Dade County, and then ends with a retail development that already exists. And so for us, it was to create a trail that really encompassed all of these different uses that already bordered the trail. And so for us, we see this as a way of reactivating a corridor, but reactivating in a way that allows the neighborhood around it to be able to take advantage of the investment that would be made by the state and local governments.
Thank you, Hussein. Greg, could you add to this conversation?
Well, I've been a longtime advocate of trails. And in San Diego, it's a pretty easy thing to advocate for because with the weather conditions we have here, active lifestyles that our residents usually exhibit, it's been something that there's been a high priority on. The County of San Diego back in 2010 adopted an initiative that we call Live Well San Diego. And it's trying to get our residents to take more responsibility for their individual health, to exercise more, to eat better, to not use tobacco products. And so the trails that we have in this county are an integral part of what we're trying to do to encourage people to develop healthier lifestyles. And why is that important? Well, it can certainly lead to millions of dollars in savings in healthcare spending, certainly reducing stress, improving mental health. And, it's an investment that we've demonstrated, I think, at the county level in our own budget in trying to put more money into hiking trails and biking trails and working with the other 18 cities in the county to try to get all of them to take the same type of approach. And most of those counties have adopted our Live Well initiative. Here in San Diego, we've taken a bit of a self-help approach. We're fortunate that in 1988, the voters of San Diego County approved a half-cent sales tax for transportation projects. A small part of that was set aside for bicycle improvements. That was reauthorized in 2006 and goes for another 40 years. So we have a revenue stream that will be providing some level of assistance in leveraging the state and federal funds to complete some of these bike projects that we have in the San Diego region. One of those projects that I've been involved with, and I appreciate the previous recognition from Rails to Trails, is what we call the Bayshore Bikeway. It's using an old rail corridor that goes back to the 1880s. Used to go along San Diego Bay all the way out to the Hotel del Coronado. And over the last ensuing since 1978, we've been working to try to get portions of that completed. It's about 2/3 completed around San Diego Bay as a Class 1 bike path. And we think with the funding that we have been able to set aside through this half-cent sales tax and leveraging it with some other state and federal funds, that we should be able to complete that bike path probably within the next 3 to 4 years. And it's probably one of the most scenic bike paths you're going to find anywhere in the country. I think the total elevation that you have to go as you ride around it is probably about 10 feet. So it's pretty easy. Not only is it great from a recreational standpoint, but frankly, it goes by a lot of our more industrialized areas, particularly the shipbuilding facilities. And we look at it as something that's going to be a significant component of trying to get a mode shift, getting more and more people out of their cars, particularly as they're going from the southern part of the county to the mid-city areas. It actually would be quicker for people to ride their bicycles to go to those shipyards than it is to try to drive their cars and fight for a parking space somewhere. So I've advocated for trails in my supervisory districts. I'm very proud of the fact that we have 3 river valleys in my district. We have 11 watersheds in San Diego County, and ironically, all of them are really planned to be part of an urban spine system, if you will, into our main bicycle routes. And so the 3 watersheds I have, we've been able to develop 22.5 miles of trails in the Tijuana River Valley, another 15 miles of trails in the Sweetwater River Valley. Both of those feed into the Bayshore Bikeway. And in the Otay River Valley, we have about 8 miles of trails that are also completed that tie into the Bayshore Bikeway. So yeah, we're big on trails in San Diego County. We obviously want to work with all of you and Rails to Trails to make sure we have some additional funding that can complete some of these projects in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you for that. Jenny, what would you like to add?
Well, I represent a city, and it's a city of 30,000 people and 30,000 students. So we're relatively small. We go into rural areas, and so we're on a different scale, but we derive lots of the same benefits. We still have people that complain about traffic and would like to get around the traffic by using the trail. We still have people who want to get out and exercise. We have topography. Not like those big mountains out west, but we have our nice Appalachian Mountains, and so people who want to get out and ride their bicycle have trouble on our narrow streets, have trouble with topography, and they really appreciate having a rail trail that goes at the grade that a train would go, rather than some of the other grades that we have available. So we're at the point where we have 48 miles. I always say 50 because I'm a politician, but we have 50 miles of rail trails in our area. So we have a trail along the Mon River and a trail along Deckers Creek. And we would love to be in a position similar to the Great Allegheny Passage, where we had a long trail that we were connected to, where we could go miles and miles and miles, where we could go to Pittsburgh, where we could cut across the state to Parkersburg and then get over to Ohio. So apparently we have about 23 more miles to go in West Virginia, and we have about 52 miles to go, give or take, between Pittsburgh and Parkersburg. So we're right on the cusp of achieving this, and it would be wonderful. My husband and I bicycled from around Connellsville area to Washington, D.C. for a wedding at one point. And we had the bride's family brought our clothes, so we didn't have to put those in the panniers, but we bicycled across. And we got such a nice intimate view of each town we came through. We used goods and services each town we went through. We didn't carry all of our food. We had to buy food along the way, and we just really enjoyed that opportunity. And when I'm on our trail, I'll meet somebody from North Carolina, and I'll meet somebody from Ohio, and they've met in Morgantown, and they've decided to ride our 50 miles of trail. Imagine if we had more miles and we were all connected up, how many more visitors we would have, and how many more opportunities for people who live here to be able to use that trail system.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And John, what do you see in Louisville?
Well, Kevin, first, it's exciting to hear about what's going on in these other communities also. But, you know, our exciting project is the Louisville Loop. The idea for it really started back in the 80s, and momentum continued to build until really in the early 90s, when there was a plan for this shared use path that would encircle Louisville Metro, Jefferson County. And I guess the thing that excites me about it is the hope is it would serve two purposes, not just for recreation, but also to help for utilitarian trips also. At this point, you know, we've got about half of the Louisville Loop complete. So half of that 100 miles. We're very excited about that. It really looks back to the idea that our city is a city of parks. We look back to the legacy that Frederick Olmsted laid when some of our wonderful parks were created here in Louisville. And so the idea at that time was when Iroquois and Shawnee and Cherokee Park were created, they were on the outskirts of the city. But as the city grew, like I said, back in the 80s or 90s, the idea was, okay, what's the next step? And so the Louisville Loop was envisioned to be just that, to help people connect to parks. Certainly the closer folks are to parks, the more opportunities they have to get out and exercise, and the more it's going to help with the health and welfare of our community.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to go to each of the panelists with a couple more questions. I'm going to go back to Hussein, and Hussein, I want to raise the issue of public-private partnerships. We hear about that quite a bit in the news, and thought you could give us some insights into what kind of considerations go into play when a private company looks at the question of partnering with a public agency to move a trail project forward. What's that thought process, and what makes that work?
Great question. So, maybe I'll localize it and talk a little bit on how we approached it with Miami-Dade County and the local cities that our corridor runs through. So our major concern was, as we sold this corridor, from our perspective, there are very few opportunities where you can unlock value from an asset where development occurs, but at the same time that development occurs, a transportation alternative is, incorporated in it. So when I talk about trail-oriented development, part of the public-private partnership was we had development rights throughout the corridor. So if you think about a 6.2-mile corridor, if you had development rights along that entire corridor, the trail and the development would have a much more difficult time interacting with one another. And so our partnership with Miami-Dade County actually took those development rights that were spread over those 6.2 miles and actually created 4 nodes. And those nodes happen to be at major intersections where the trail and some major east-west roads intersected. And so by moving all the development rights into those 4 nodes, what you end up having is a really nice trail development amongst the 6.2 miles that is anchored by these 4 nodes. But then what was important for us is as we invest in these developments that encourage people to use the corridor, the long-term sustainability of that trail is very important. And I'll give you an example. We went out to see the Katy Trail in Dallas. And one of the lessons learned that we picked up from Dallas was once the trail was put in place, all the development that occurred around it, they weren't able to take advantage of it. There was no tax increment district or TIF mechanism that was created. And so what you basically had was this trail that was created, that development occurred around it, but every year, the Friends of Katy Trail start at zero and have to raise money in order to maintain that trail. Contrast that to a trail in Atlanta, the Atlanta Beltline. Atlanta Beltline learned and put a tax increment district together. So as that development occurred, they have a revenue source every year that they're able to maintain and improve the trail as needed. And so one of the public-private partnerships for us is we're willing to make the investment into these developments at the nodes. What we also wanted to make sure was the county had a revenue stream. And so we proposed ideas such as a tax increment district and some other kind of innovative concepts that we're working through. But for us, what's very important in that partnership is to make sure that once that land is conveyed into public ownership, that the public has a revenue stream that's dedicated to making sure that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the vision everyone contemplated on day one is the vision that still exists.
Great. A little bit of change of pace, Hussein. When I first met you, it was probably over a decade ago. You were Deputy Chief of Staff at U.S. Department of Transportation. So I know you're a keen observer of the federal policy environment. I just wonder if you have any perspective on what you think might happen this year in terms of infrastructure legislation.
Yeah, a great question. So, and you're probably aging me there a little bit, but look, I think without a doubt, the infrastructure bill is going to create a good debate around issues such as, gas tax and other funding mechanisms in order to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent. When I think back to almost 10 years ago, when I was at USDOT, the same funding issues and quandaries we had 10 years ago exist today, except the difference is, they're worse. And so, we talk about user fees, we talk about private investment and encouraging private investment, we talk about private activity bonds, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to do more with less. And that really is, I think, going to be the focus of the debate. I also think that from a federal level, there'll continue to be the debate as to you know, when we started funding transportation at the federal level, if we go back and think about the highway system we built, once we built out that highway system, then a lot of other programs started being put in place because we had all this revenue coming in, but we didn't necessarily have the same needs. And so other forms of transportation, whether it's transit, whether it's bike paths, whether it's other transportation alternative funding that went into place, I think will be, you know, will be strongly debated. And what's the role of the federal government in transportation funding versus state and local? And folks that I've spoken to, I think there's a lot of people that feel that the federal government should be investing in projects that have more of a regional significance as opposed to a local focus. So, for example, a streetcar project or a local transit project, is that something where the federal government should be investing? And I think in that debate, we have to recognize that trails are often seen as very local projects, and so therefore being a loud advocate for the importance of these types of projects will be important in that overall debate.
Yeah, thank you, Hussein. So we're going to turn to Jenny now, and you had mentioned about the Industrial Heartlands Trail, a multi-state trail network, and as I understand it, the vision is to make the region a premier tourist destination, among other things. So I just want maybe opine further on how you see an interstate trail network enabling, you know, Morgantown to reach its goals.
So I have a date of 2004. Somewhere around there is when our trails got started, and I'm sure there was a lot of work. In fact, I was familiar with a lot of work before that point. But regardless, we've had a certain amount of development along our trail. We have hotel, we have it's a hotel conference center. We have a new West Virginia University building, new kind of around, you know, the last 10 years ago. And so now we're kind of at the next wave. There are some empty blank spots. Property values went up, and so it gets harder to develop. And so there are some blank areas on our waterfront, and our trail follows the river. So the waterfront and the trail are all completely connected, and it's beautiful along our trail. But we're just at a point where we need to have the next step. So we've been talking about it being maybe a renaissance or Marvel on the Mon or some kind of next step. So part of this next step is we've had interest from someone who wants to bring a riverboat. He's going to call it the Mountaineer Star. Bring a riverboat to town. No, not for gambling, but for tourism up and down our lovely river. Well, that is immediately adjacent to the trail and would be integrated, you know, would be the type of thing where someone could put their bicycle on the boat and go upstream a ways and then ride back down on the trail. Or you could have all kinds of interesting combinations of transportation. So people are seeing that we have an exciting waterfront, and the possibility of people coming through, of van tours coming through, bus tours going through, of possibly more hotels, of other kinds of development along our river. We're redoing our waterfront, so our amphitheater and our trailhead and our trail bathroom, having a better venue to prepare for what will probably come, since there aren't too many more miles to complete. But it starts with, you know, having that vibrant trail, the people coming through. You're talking about in Florida, you know, all the different, you know, what could be along a trail. You can have industrial uses along a trail, which we have, but then you can have some of the other uses along a trail where businesses and housing and people can move in. And really, we're working on lighting so that we could take advantage of what will probably come.
Great. So perhaps I'm hearing that you're seeing the trail as relevant to some of the formidable challenges that your region is facing.
Yes. So one challenge that we face is obesity, and there's a group in the state of West Virginia called Try This that has a whole website of activities trying to get people moving and people to eat healthier. We have a new wellness commission at the city. They're all different groups that are taking health concerns very seriously, and so that is something where visitors want to have some healthy recreation options, and residents want to have healthy recreation options. But the area that I was talking about earlier is economic development, and we need to diversify our economy. We have hospitals in our area, we have West Virginia University, we have federal institutions, and to bring people in to work at these different venues, we need to have vibrant recreation options. People expect there to be amenities when they come to a community, and so part of being competitive is having those options available. And I think a trail is something that people ask for directly and something that employers mention. So I just think that that's a key component to all of our communities.
Thank you. We're going to shift now to Greg Cox. And you had mentioned in the previous question of when San Diego County had invested sales tax in transportation, including trails. And I want, maybe we can dig into that a little further, because I think that's incredibly interesting. You know, what were all the motivations and political considerations that went into that decision? And then has it really proven worth the investment over time?
Well, in San Diego right now, it's about 70 degrees, beautiful weather outside. So we have a population that I think really relies on getting outside, having active lifestyles, enjoying the fresh air and the weather. We believe that a region with a better trail system helps address a lot of the complex issues like public health, like livability. And when you're talking about bicycle paths, it certainly helps with traffic congestion, which is a big problem in the Southern California area, certainly as it relates to air quality, climate change. We have a lot of state regulations coming out of Sacramento that are requiring us to reduce our greenhouse gases. And so we really look at the bike paths and trying to get people to get outside and look at other modes of transportation as something that is going to help us meet some of those high goals that have been set by our state legislature. And certainly we think it improves the quality of life of people that live in the San Diego region. And you're right about investing local tax dollars into our trails. As I mentioned, we've got the two self-help initiatives that we had in '88, and then it was continued in 2006 for a half-cent sales tax. And what that has allowed us to do is the program has now yielded since 1988 about 650 different projects addressing highway, transit, bike and pedestrian paths, habitat conservation, local street repairs, and grant projects and programs that have totaled more than $13.7 billion since 1988. And it envisions several completed bikeways over the program's 60-year lifespan. So with that as kind of a starting point, we have to look to our Metropolitan Planning Organization. We call it SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Counties. Worked with them to develop a regional bike plan, which proposes a vision for diverse regional bicycle system of interconnected corridors, support facilities, programs, and interconnected corridors that will make bicycling in the San Diego region a convenient and in some cases a preferred mode of transportation. The plan guides the development of our regional bike network through the year 2050 and projects that connectivity will increase mode share by more than 4%. In other words, increasing from around 3% right now, which is pretty small, to 7% by 2030. In 2013, our region approved through the Transnet program a $200 million early advance, if you will, of the Transnet funding. In other words, what we did was we borrowed $200 million to implement the regional plan, early action plan, which has allowed us to do three things. It's allowed us to implement identified high priority projects within the next 10 years, and we're about 3 years into that. It executes opportunities for supporting programs outlined in the bike plan, and then it funds local bike and pedestrian projects through a competitive grant program. Now, one of the things that always comes up is, does an investment in bicycle paths and trails, does it really have an economic spinoff? And I think one of the best examples I think I can throw out to you from the San Diego region is we were completing a section of the Bayshore Bikeway from Chula Vista over to Imperial Beach, 2 of the 5 cities that are on the Bayshore Bikeway. It probably was about a $2.5 million project. While we were building that, there was a gentleman who bought 2 industrial buildings. They were 2 15,000 square foot buildings that were basically used for storage and not producing really any real revenue for anybody other than the landlord. A gentleman bought those buildings, saw what we were doing with the bikeway, and so he brought in an architect and he came up with a whole plan which he calls Bikeway Village. That Bikeway Village project is about almost a $5 million project that is just now being completed. It includes a bicycle shop, bicycle rentals, a coffee shop. One of the buildings has been purchased by the Coronado Brewing Company, which is a kind of a craft brewer. San Diego is well known now as a craft brewing destination. And they're in the process of putting in a distillery there, and we'll be opening up a restaurant in the next couple of months. That will generate a significant number of jobs. As I said, it's a $5 million investment. It's going to create jobs. It's going to further enhance the Bayshore Bikeway, and is one of those things that we think is a good example of why investing in bicycle paths and trails does have an economic spinoff and something that adds to the local economy in addition to just the recreational and other amenities that a bicycle path does. The other thing that is going on right now is, with a lot of investment in border infrastructure, we're seeing the federal government put in major improvements at the Tijuana border crossing. There's a bicycle passenger or pedestrian crossing that is there, and we're in the process now of developing and fully funded now through this early action plan, a connection from the border to the Bayshore Bikeway.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn now to John. And could you tell us how the Louisville Loop has contributed to the economic vision for your region?
Well, at least here in Kentucky, we talk about Louisville as being the economic engine for our state. And that's not just because there's a lot of jobs there, but it's because it's a destination. It's where people want to live. And people wouldn't want to live in our community if it wasn't for the parks and opportunities for recreation. Louisville Loop certainly adds to that. So it certainly enhances that. And some of the things that I mentioned, the idea about trails-oriented development. I don't know that we necessarily had that in mind, but I like that term and like the idea that that's what we're seeing with the Louisville Loop, particularly one of the more transformative pieces of it that's recently been completed is the parklands of Floyd's Fork. And that section, not only did it help preserve the ecosystem around Floyd's Fork itself, but created a series of parks there. Now the debate in the community is how will development occur along that area, and so we're hoping to manage that in an appropriate way. But that's just an example of how this idea of a loop that initially was maybe thought to be for recreation and to promote health has also spurred economic development. I think also, many cities are vying for things like Amazon or wherever, whatever company. And when you're courting a company like that, what folks are looking for is mobility options, opportunities for active transportation, recreation. So we see the Louisville Loop as an asset to our community from that perspective also.
Great, thank you. So we're going to start to transition to collecting audience questions, but while we're waiting for those to roll in and get prioritized and organized, I want to ask you all a question about funding. A number of you have touched upon, the importance of funding for your trail networks. Definitely, we've seen partnerships in terms of local, state, and federal money going into these projects. What are some of the innovative ways you've put together packages of funding to move these projects forward? How do you get those gaps filled as rapidly as possible, given funding challenges? Anyone want to jump in first? We can have a brief. Yeah,
I
John.
understand in San Diego County, because of our San Diego Association of Governments, they've been kind of the lead agents on the Bayshore Bikeway at least. And one of the things we've been able to do is leverage money and shift it around. Sometimes we get some state money that we hadn't anticipated, and we will shift that with federal funds and put it towards other projects. So the ability to have some funds available to start projects, to have the design work done on a lot of projects. I mean, with whatever future infrastructure bill may be approved by the Congress and presented by the president, having shovel-ready projects available, I think, is going to make you much more competitive if there's in fact, a competitive process. So we've, I think, done a very good job of that. We've been able to look to our state government. They have a California active transportation plan that periodically will have money available for bicycle projects. And so by having plans ready to go, we've been able to tap into those funds better than probably most other areas in California.
Thank you. Jenny.
We have the Mon River Trails Conservancy. It's in Morgantown, and they work very hard across the state at trying to help connect up the trails and obtain funding for that. I was counting up maybe 6 projects: a trailhead project, a resurfacing project, a pedestrian bridge, a trailhead facility, and that's about $1 million in current projects. So we're sort of like the little engine that could, that this Mon River Trails Conservancy gets all the support I can ever muster because of putting together these different grant projects. So usually it's the 80% in funding, and then we need to come up with the 20% match. And so anytime something's in the city limits, I work really hard to try to make sure that we have the match, and then support the group wherever else we can scrounge money. So it's tricky to get that 20%, but I don't think we've let any opportunities go by that we didn't make the match. So that's why this federal funding is so important.
Good.
Kevin, I'd probably just add a couple things. So number one, I think we took a little different approach because we really felt that the way the money would come together is this trail needed to be activated. And so in partnership with a lot of companies throughout Miami-Dade County, as well as the Knight Foundation and the Miami Foundation, we actually have spent over $1 million holding events on the corridor. So on Saturdays, you'd have yoga on the corridor. On Saturday evenings, you'd have a movie in one of the parks that abutted the corridor. We would have signature events during Halloween and during other holidays. And we started events where, 2 years ago, there were 10 people showing up. Our signature events now get 2,500 people out on the trail on a regular basis. And so I think the community really buying in, through making contributions to the Miami-Dade Foundation really helped. I think also, look, we're all very blessed with growing budgets right now. So the state of Florida has an $11 billion transportation budget. I know your colleague Ken in Florida was very instrumental in creating the Sun Trail program. The state of Florida had a competitive program where it allowed cities and communities to come and ask for construction dollars. And that's always been kind of the missing kind of link. It's easy to acquire land, and then it's very hard to get the construction money, and then even harder to get the ongoing maintenance money. That Sun Trail program really helped. The state of Florida has really stepped up in our project They've already committed 11 million from an acquisition standpoint, 8 million from a construction standpoint. And when you add that to the local community, money that they've pledged, we've put together a project that, right now neighbors over $30 million in commitments. So, and so when you add that, I don't want to have what gets lost in this is the fact that it's so important to have corporate buy-in on these projects, because that's really how you end up activating these corridors on a regular basis.
Okay, thanks. So the questions are actually pouring in now. And John, I want to turn to you with the first one that came in. It says, how do you demonstrate economic benefits? And then this particular person must be snowed in right now because they gave that as an example of where that might raise questions about using the trail year round. But in any case, how do you go about demonstrating economic benefits in Louisville?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that is a challenge sometimes on projects, trails projects. One of the, I think, performance measures that can be used, though, is just looking at property values adjacent to a corridor. Certainly, that's one way to measure that. I think there's been various studies that have shown that when trails projects are put in, that property values do go up. I think that's one thing that we need to be better at in the transportation field, is establishing those performance measures and seeing what the true impacts of our projects are. That's the initial thing that I would say, though.
Okay, thank you. So I have another one where the person writing in is concerned that the local elected officials where they live view trails and bike paths as attracting only service industry jobs. And they're wondering, do you see evidence in your communities where trails have attracted more than just low-wage jobs? A volunteer to answer that.
Well, go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, Jenny.
Well, so we have lots of service businesses like attorneys' offices and architects' offices and other offices that have chosen to relocate near the trail and rehab buildings because they're interested in that amenity for there, and also at least one engineering firm. I'm trying to going up and down the corridor, but numerous people have chosen to locate on the trail, and I assume that helps them recruit top dollar people. Also, when someone owns their own business along the trail, that should pay back in higher than minimum wage jobs. Some of the restaurant jobs are at restaurants that are upper end restaurants that I think they make good tips. So there's 3 upper end restaurants along our trail. So I don't think there's a natural affinity for low wage jobs along a trail. I would say maybe the opposite, that it raises the level of income for people who are along the trail compared to other locations, because it's such a wonderful, it's raising the property values. And so I just don't see it that way at all.
Okay, thank you. I have another good question here that I want to see who might raise their hand for, is how can local trail users and friends groups help make trails world-class and iconic?
Well, the Bayshore Bikeway has been a labor of love on the part of a lot of people over 40 years now that we've been working on it, and we think it will be done in the next 3 to 4 years. From a recreational standpoint, it certainly is getting a lot of usage. We have a San Diego Bicycle Coalition that has an annual event that gets about close to 4,000 people out there. It's the only chance you have to ride your bicycle over the Coronado Bridge in any given year. And the hotels, the motels, that's one of the things they market when they let people know about their amenities, is the fact that it's on the Bayshore Bikeway. The other part of it is, now that we're getting close to getting the bicycle path completed in Barrio Logan section of San Diego, it clearly will be a much quicker mode of transportation for people that work at the shipyards to get to work, and it's going to be a lot less trouble than trying to find a parking place. So it's got a lot of spin-off benefits. And as we've seen with the Bikeway Village project, it's creating jobs, it's improving property values, and certainly is a nice addition to the community.
Okay. All right. So the next question has to do with making the case for trails. Really, the question is, which arguments are most effective? Is it economic benefits? Is it health? Is it environment? Is it reduced traffic? What works best in your experience?
All of the above. I think any investment you make in bicycle paths and trails is going to be an investment that's going to encourage recreational usage and improving lifestyles and actually having a good economic return on those investments. It's our experience in San Diego has been, I don't know what the exact dollar ratio would be, but it certainly is an investment in the future of our communities, and it does create jobs and it does increase property values.
I think it's very important to have projects that you show you can take care of. I think that's another way that you can sell rail trails as an economic benefit. If people don't see that you've taken care of your trails or that you've taken care of the amenities along your trails, I think that's a huge detriment. So we just obtained a new grant to make some improvements along our riverfront with our amphitheater and our trailhead, and that was the funder's main concern, was making sure that we were setting aside funds. You were talking about having a stream of funds or having dedicated money so that you can show that you can keep it up, because any asset that you don't make distinctive and that you don't keep up just isn't going to be a real asset to your community. So that's one of the ways that you can show stability for all of those purposes you were talking about.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so the next question's for John. Mitch McConnell, the U.S. Senator, he's the majority leader. Long ago, he was your local official. Do you have any sense of his perspective regarding the Louisville Loop and whether the federal government should play a role in getting it built?
Well, I would say this, that the project I mentioned earlier, the portion of the Louisville Loop, the parklands for Floyd's Fork, Senator McConnell was instrumental in pushing that project. Senator McConnell helped assist us with about $50 million in transportation funding to go along with that project. Those funds were primarily used for the roadway infrastructure and the shared use path that went through the corridor or through that series of parks. But then locally, David Jones, who was the founder of Humana Healthcare, helped raise $50 million in private funds to go along with that. So, $100 million to create a series of parks, 19 miles of our Louisville Loop. So I can say that I don't know if I was sitting and having a conversation with Senator McConnell today, what he would say, but what I would say to him is that Senator McConnell, you know how much the people of Louisville appreciate the parklands and how that's been transformative for our community. And I think he would readily acknowledge that and acknowledge that it's an investment that was well worth making.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So I would invite others to chime in on this question of the federal role in getting trails built. And, in your experience, Supervisor Cox, obviously a lot of local skin in the game, but, are you also taking advantage of federal resources? And, it's to all of you, but that's an example where I've heard you talk, mostly about that local role, and now let's round it out and see the full picture of what kinds of resources you pull together to make sure these networks can get built.
Well, none of these projects are going to get built by themselves, and they're only going to get built because we're able to draw on a variety of funding streams. And certainly a better commitment from the federal government to put money towards bicycle paths and trails is something that would be a good starting point. It would allow us to leverage those funds with local funds. We have some local funds to the county that we can draw on, and we frequently do, to kind of do the early planning, so that if there are other federal or state funds that come along, we can actually, hopefully get at the front of the line. Having shovel-ready projects available, particularly if you're going to be involved in a competitive process, gives you a couple of legs up, I think, in regards to whether you're going to get those projects funded and certainly accelerate the completion of those projects. So we look forward to having a more robust federal partner, if you will, and whatever comes together with the infrastructure package.
Great.
Kevin, I think we also need to recognize that there are some federal programs that the local governments make decisions on how they're allocated. And so depending on your state, CMAQ dollars, for example, congestion mitigation, air quality, safe route to schools. So there are some programs like that even though they're federal funds, because they are decided at the local level, when we talk about local governments supporting these projects, sometimes they're doing it through allocating some of these federal dollars that flow down. And so I think making sure that these types of programs are on the front burner of elected officials' minds are really important. I'd also say I think there'll be depending on how the Tiger Grant program and other USDOT grant programs continue to be implemented, maybe as a standalone, these types of projects may have a tough time competing against other modes of transportation. But when they're incorporated into a more complete solution, a congestion solution, I think they'll be more competitive. So, as people are thinking about Tiger grants and other USDOT grant programs, I'd encourage them to look at it as part of a complete solution to address congestion as opposed to a standalone.
Thank you for that. So we're out of time. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for their thoughtful participation today, their tremendous work back home. Given the power of trails to transform America, as that infrastructure debate heats up in Washington, Rails to Trails is going to stay on the front line for the inclusion of trails and active transportation networks in infrastructure legislation. We're calling on Congress to robustly fund trail networks, and we do need your help. You can find resources to engage and sign up at railstotrails.org/trailstransform, or you can follow us at Rails to Trails and the hashtag TrailsTransformUS on Twitter. And then we're going to have live State of the Union commentary there as well. So invite you, all the participants, to do that and engage in those ways. And thank you for coming today and listening. Thank you.